Dobry Utri Tuberovsky. You know, there's nothing more richly ironic than the Western world's so-called war on drugs, especially when it's been the world's chief narcotic peddler for years. In one sense, I mean this literally. The most recent example, or perhaps not the most recent, but certainly one of the most notorious in modern years, was allowing the Nicaraguan Contras to push crack cocaine in U.S. cities in the 1980s to fund their covert war in Central America with CIA connivance. The explosion of gang-banging drug violence was the Rambo world of Ronald Reagan brought home in more ways than one. One of the most egregious examples in history, though, comes from the mid-19th century. Opium and heroin are thought of as Asian substances that brought their own people low and are out to destroy the West. But in fact, these were forced upon China by the British at gunpoint. The British Empire wanted free trade with China, but the old emperors were not dopes. They knew the long-nosed devils were out for control of their empire for the benefit of no one but European capital. But since the West, in the form of the British Merchant Navy, had nothing substantial to offer in exchange for the goods they sought, they forced on China the one thing it did have, and has now come in possession of again, the poppy fields of Central Asia, backed with superior explosive firepower that could be deployed offshore with no fear of retaliation. A derivative need was created, and by means of threatening massive shock-and-awe invasion, China was turned into a nation of addicts, pacified into lotus land dreams, while the real world was stolen out from under them. Starting to sound familiar? Yet, narcotics can come in forms other than processed substances one intakes directly into the bloodstream. Opiates can be thought of metaphorically as well, as ideas that do not jibe with reality but are intended to soothe and pacify and thereby produce a passive population. The most famous metaphoric example was Karl Marx's equation of religion as the opiate of the people, a phrase first used by de Sade in his 1797 novel Juliet, from which I'll quote a few sentences. Yeah, here we go. You fear the powerful eye of genius, that is why you encourage ignorance. This opium you feed your people, so that, drugged, they do not feel the hurts inflicted by you. And as there is no honor nor profit in being wise, nobody seeks after wisdom. Nobody involves himself in public affairs, and for all this compensation is offered in the form of luxury, of frivolity, of entertainments. So it is that among you a taste for trivial things replaces a taste for great ones, at the time which ought to be devoted to the latter is frittered away on futilities, and that you will be subjected sooner or later and again by any foe who bothers to make the effort. And when Marx used it a half-century later in his 1843 critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, it was with a deep compassion for the addict's moral desperation and physical destitution. To quote the famous phrase in full, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is, therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo, which was added to 4 years later by Charles Kingsley, none other than the canon of the Church of England, who wrote, "We have used the Bible as if it were a mere special constable's handbook, an opium dose for keeping beasts of burden patient while they were being overloaded, a mere book to keep the poor in order." But to be fair, let's also hear the anti-atheist counter-argument of Polish social critic Czesław Miłosz, who wrote in his The Discreet Charm of Nihilism that a true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged. And of course, there was also the famous phrase by Mikhail Bakunin, the founder of Russian anarchism, who wrote, "Be assured that whenever priests and politicians crank out paeans to God, that the sheep are about to be fleeced." Well, despite the differences in society between religious tradition and modern secular ideologies, the West is still in the business of forcing opiates on the rest of the world in the name of trade. But rather than the physical commodity itself, The very process of commodity exchange has been abstracted and processed into a derivative drug called free market democracy, forced onto the rest of the planet to turn its inhabitants into passive consumers, chasing the moment's pleasures, or the illusion of pleasure with the shadow play of marketed free elections as a narcotic substitute for real sovereignty and self-government. The impoverished masses are told that this free market democracy they see around them, turning their streets into ghettos of want and despair, is the end of history, in Francis Fukuyama's Nirvana Lotus Land phrase, while of course the sovereignty of their real world is plundered out from under their feet by Western powers whose extraterritorial rule is backed with the latest high-tech instruments of war, which they will deploy with the same ruthlessness of colonial conquest as the 19th century forebears. Free market democracy and weapons of mass destruction are partners that depend totally on one another for proper good cop, bad cop effect. So, whoa, who is that? Hello? Ronald Reagan. We just wanted to let our viewers know that you resent Marx's classic phrase because for you, free market democracy was no opiate, but a reality. Well, maybe so, but only for those living off capital gains. For the rest of us, it's just a pipe dream, like trying to promote democracy in Nicaragua by turning Los Angeles into the rock desert of the free market.